Hello, Laura.
Hi, Roberto.
How are you this morning?
I'm good. It's a good day in New York City, don't you think?
It is. Yes, it is. It is a good day. So I want to start with the literally an hour ago, the mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, announced his transition team. And I just want to hear your thoughts. I know you had the pleasure of working with a lot of these folks, and I just want to hear what you think. And I want to just say, before we sort of lean in, that prior to the multiple hats you've worn in government, the commissioner of the fire department, you're also a campaign person and an operative. So you've worn that hat as well. You've worked in consulting, you've advised candidates. So I know that you've worked in that space as well. So for you to give an analysis on the outcome of the election, what Zoran did right and wrong, and what your thoughts overall are, you're definitely qualified to do that as well, right? Because you've worked in that space. But anyway, I've talked too much now. I want to let you speak on your thoughts on the transition and the folks he appointed.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the sort of callback to the rest of my resume because I do think people forget that, right? My last job was so highly visible and public, and I was there for 10 years, as you know, before I was commissioner. But for a decade, I worked on campaigns and actually particularly insurgent candidates. So a lot of analogies to what's happening now. And I've worked on two transitions. So I have a pretty good sense, I'd say, of what it takes to run a campaign, what it takes to govern, what that transition is like for everyone involved, right? And you know that too, how difficult it is, no matter who you are, like running New York City government is really, really hard. It's a big job. And the transition from the campaign to government can be difficult. So I've seen it all, I think, and have a good sense of what it takes. And I would say, early signs I think are great in that he's putting a lot of experienced people in charge of government or advising him on running government. So that I think makes me feel good. It's a recognition that it takes a lot of people, and I think that's one thing we don't talk about much. Is like you just need to hire a lot of people. Nobody, no matter what role they had before, knows the number of people that you need to fill New York City government roles. And you need people who have real serious experience, in the trenches doing it. And I think he's doing that. So I think, he's answering at least early the question of kind of what will be his first steps and does he recognize how difficult that job is going to be? And I think the answer is yes, he does.
All right, let's take a step back. What insurgent campaigns did you work on? Let's take a walk down
Yeah.
memory lane.
So I've done a lot. Maybe I'll stick to the folks who are still in our orbit now. And I think people would, in many cases, find it funny, the idea of these people being insurgents, but it just shows you how cyclical politics is. But Mark Levine, who was elected comptroller last night, I've known him, almost as long as I've lived in New York, 20 years, and worked on every election, I think, that he's ever had, and he was elected as controller last night, and he was an insurgent candidate in his early days in Inwood and Morningside Heights. I've worked for Yvette Clarke, who also is now a sitting Congress member and somebody who's been in leadership. Hakeem Jeffries, who obviously is very much in leadership now. Bill de Blasio, who we worked with together, as you recall, was in seventh place when I began working with him on the campaign. So some folks who have really made it, who started as insurgents. So there's a real, I think, group of folks who know what it's like actually to make that change from a campaign of a handful of people to running a whole government.
Laura, walk us through how you go from being first deputy commissioner at the fire department to commissioner of the fire department, first woman, and which is again forever in the history of the city of New York. You are the first, so that is impressive.
I
Uh,
appreciate that.
yeah,
Thank you.
no, it is.
Yeah, I think, my journey was very unexpected, not just to other people, but to myself. It was not my plan at any point. When I went to the fire department, I thought it would be temporary to solve some, really sort of intractable problems they were facing around their hiring, the funding of the organization, technology. One thing I probably realize now that I didn't realize then is, of course, those weren't going to be quick problems to fix. And so it does make sense. I ended up staying there so much longer than I intended. It's also a really wonderful place. And so, it really sucked me in. But it never was my intention to lead the agency. It really was, a series of sort of circumstantial events, but also just the fact that once I was there, I was really surprised how much they needed someone with my sort of external experience.
Mm.
Of course, we know that they, put out fires and respond to medical emergencies, but like any huge organization, it's a behemoth to run, right? It's $2.3 billion, it's 17,000 people. The commissioner really is a CEO position. It's not an operational role, it's to run the organization. But I didn't realize how much they didn't have very many people like that. There were a few, but not a lot. And so when I came over and I said things like, if we need budget money here, here's how we get it. If we need to upgrade our technology, here's how we do that in an institution. Here's how we modernize an institution. If we want to reduce our liability and change the way we hire and see more diverse workforce, here's how we think about that. I didn't think I'd be the first one to say those things, but I think in many cases I was the first one. Maybe to say them is a little bit not true, but to say them and to stay there and do them. I think I was the first one to sort of volunteer that. And so it meant that, there was much more that they needed from me than I ever realized I had to give them. And that's really, I kept going. My portfolio just kept growing because we kept needing things and things had to get done. We had to upgrade the 911 system. Once we had success in diversifying some of our first fire classes, then we looked at diversifying other parts of the department, modernizing it technologically. When I got there, they were on mimeographs and fax machines, if you even like remember what those are. And by the time I left, they were using smartphones and robotics. And so like that, that in and of itself is a sort of decade-long effort. And then Commissioner Nigro suddenly retired. It was not expected. And I became acting. And, I was acting for a while, as you know. And, I think finally the administration saw that, I really did know how to do the job. And that I will say, I think women actually have a hard time saying that. You can probably even hear me having a hard time saying it, but I actually believe it to be true. I spent 8 years and every waking second of my day learning that job. And by the time I stepped in to do it, I knew it better than anyone else did around me. And I knew that. And so I think that became clear, even though it hadn't been my intention. I did not think Commissioner Nigro would leave. I did not think I'd be considered for the job. I think it became obvious once I was doing it that I really did know what I was doing.
Laura, I want to take a step back, and again, I'm a New Yorker through and through. I was born here. I've been here my entire life. Growing up, you heard these, and again, this is just perception, maybe my own, that the NYPD and the FDNY were, well, I don't know. I want to make sure I use the right choice of word. It was different. A lot of nepotism associated to both, and I'm talking about as a native New Yorker. They were not traditionally reflective of the general population in New York City. Obviously, there was a big lawsuit, in terms of the FDNY and PD. Just my own sense has been quicker in terms of changing and diversifying the rank and file. But both of a tradition like moving a super tanker. I want to talk about some of your just like, what was that like coming in saying, hey, I want the agency to be reflective of New York City? What type of resistance did you meet? And talk about what you feel most proud of in terms of, again, the changes you made. Now, again, I walk down the street, I've seen women firefighters, I don't want to date myself, but it's a good thing. Again, I see as I go by firehouses, I see more and more, people of color, young men and women of color in the department. But I want to hear your take on your experience, how you moved the needle, and some of the things you encountered and some of the obstacles you faced in doing so.
Yeah, I think I can validate some of what you were trying to say with just the facts. And I think that helps here. I think sometimes when we get into talking about race and gender, diversity and change, we often get into like really heated sort of political rhetoric. But the reality is NYPD and FDNY who do amazing things for this city have had lawsuits that have just proven, in the facts in court that there were issues with their hiring, that there were significant advantages given to people who had family on the job, and that had downstream effects that excluded many groups, especially Black and Brown New Yorkers, especially women. To answer your question about NYPD sort of seeming to move that needle faster, when you look at those lawsuits that exposed those issues with hiring and then corrected them, they start about 20 years earlier at NYPD. So it's actually sort of simpler than you might think, which is just that scrutiny and that need to frankly reduce the liability to the agencies in paying millions of dollars in these lawsuits, but also endangering public trust by having people not know how you get hired and having them think that hiring system wasn't fair, just happened earlier in NYPD. And so NYPD has made faster progress because of that. But, I think when you talk about sort of how you get it done, I'd go back to what I said at the beginning, which is I think you have to be really careful as an agent of change about two things. One, you actually have to know that no matter how careful you are, how much you care, and how much you try to do it right, some people are going to really hate that you did it, and they're going to treat you that way. And I will say, if I'm being honest, that was a hard thing for me to accept. I have always been diplomatic. I've always been, thought of myself as kind and willing to listen. Like I've never been a person who sort of comes in with like a battering ram. Some people are, that is not me and has never been. And I thought that by doing things with that goodwill and that sort of gentle approach, you might not get that response. And I was wrong. And I do, like a lot of coaching to women and agents of change, just explain to them that that's the dynamic and you need to learn to absorb some of that if you really want to change something that you care about. So I think that's one piece of it. But the other piece I'd say that's like really, really, really important to emphasize, and I think it's underreported here, is that these issues with the hiring, where the hiring is perverted to help some people and not others, where it's not transparent, where nobody knows who gets hired or even how to apply, they hurt the vast majority of applicants, the white male applicants included, because the reality is most people don't have friends and family on the job. So while there's a small group of people who do and who may have been able to tap into that advantage over the years, most people are applying to civil service because they see it as a fair and even-handed system and a way to get a good job with union benefits. And so like what I found when we were doing this is that even though you might hear externally a lot of political hand-wringing about it, that actually internally I got many candidates coming to me just saying like, thank you for making this transparent and simpler. We feel like we all have a more fair shot at this job now. And I think that's important to say. We have tens of thousands of people who apply. I'd also say like there's not only nothing wrong with family connections, it's a beautiful thing that people make their kids believe in public service, and we want that. We just need people to feel like hiring is fair and that everybody has equal access to it. It makes us do our job better, like a frontline job better, So in this like day and age, not only do people need to have faith that their public institutions are being fair and transparent, and when we do that, like we are a more effective agency, but we are in like a rapid period of evolving change in emergency operations. So like as an example, nationwide, only about 5% of what fire departments do is put out fires. All the rest of it is complex responses to complex emergencies involving medical care, technology, construction collapses, on and on and on. And you need a constantly evolving set of skill sets in your candidates to continually meet that changing mission. You can see that same thing even in policing, which I don't want to speak too much to since that's not my expertise, but where they have to respond to mental health emergencies, to social issues. You really do need a complex set of skills in your candidates. So I think when I ask people to think about change, I believe in fairness and civil rights for everyone, but I also want people to know that these things are not just about that. They are connected to how effective we are as agencies, and they affect almost all candidates, and it's the right thing to do to make it fair for them.
Or how much of this do you think, and again, as someone who was not a firefighter, someone who, again, came from a political background, Talk about that, right? What was that like going into a place where, it's common. I know it. My uncle was a firefighter. My father was a my grandfather was a firefighter. Things like I remember the vaccine mandate and how that was even, or wearing a mask, how that was totally different than or to the most part, the most resistance seemed to have come from the FDNY. And how much do you attribute it now in hindsight to sexism?
I think that actually it's a more complicated question than that. I think people want to attribute it to one thing, but it isn't. I mean, I'd say this much. I don't know any commissioner that's ever been loved by the members it
Okay.
represents. Being the boss is hard, right? You make decisions that 50% of everybody is not going to like. And the vast majority of commissioners have never served as firefighters. About two-thirds have never served
Mm.
as
Oh,
firefighters.
interesting.
And even those who have, as you've pointed out, they've served as firefighters, they haven't necessarily run the agency before. And the job is to run the agency. So and actually in an interesting way, I'd say this, I actually always felt not only that I was more effective because I was the most experienced at being an administrator, and that's the job, but I actually felt it was also easier for me to make good and fair decisions because I didn't feel a need to prove myself as a firefighter. Like I didn't feel a need to prove toughness. I could defer to the firefighters, and I did all the time because they're the end user, right? So if we were buying new technology or we were trying to change an SOP, I would go to them and get their feedback and then make a decision based on what works in the field. And what I saw with some of the, men in the building who were both firefighters and administrators, they had a harder time taking that feedback directly from the members because they felt like, well, I outrank this person, so who am I to listen to them? And I think, frankly, that it comes from my community organizing and political background. And I think it's an important skill. Like I'm glad politics taught me that, which is you need to go to the people who actually do the job and get their feedback on the work before you make a decision, not on folks necessarily in middle management who are just passing along, sort of a game of telephone of an opinion. So as much as it may have been a public conversation, it was never one that I felt affected my ability to do my job. If anything, I felt I was better at it. And I had spent 8 years there, so I knew the place very well by the time I was making decisions.
How would you rate the coverage you got, or the treatment you received from the press?
Oh, that's an interesting question. No one has ever asked me that before.
Was it fair? And and we're friends, right? Let's
Yeah.
put that, but like separate of this conversation, we're friends. And it was, look, I felt for you because again, you're sort of again trying to make change in an institution that has worked and run a certain way since its founding. And then at the same time, every story seemed to be about drama,
Yeah.
right? Not about running, whether your response times are good, whether the actual job is
Yeah.
happening, but it was just drama. Commissioners talking to the attorney general.
Yeah.
Commissioner has litigation. Like talk about that and what that felt
Yeah.
like, and your thoughts on what the press coverage was like, and what the response was, and what your thoughts on how you responded now in hindsight, and your
Yeah.
own press and comms team.
I have two thoughts that I think are really important for other leaders, especially in a moment we're about to see a bunch of people go into institutions and try to change things about them that the public wants. And that's actually what I want to point out is that, if we
Hmm.
want to change things, we should make sure it's the thing the public is supporting. And everything I went to do has, widespread public support. I'd say two things. It's actually a great example of, I think, like what I get from a lot of New Yorkers who aren't in our world of government who say to me, we want these things to change, right? We want these institutions to be more diverse. We want to see less corruption in government. We want to see government work more efficiently. Why doesn't that ever change? I give them that example of the coverage because the coverage doesn't match what people wanted,
Hmm.
right? So people
Hmm.
said to me, make, tackle corruption, make this more efficient, make them more diverse. And then when you go to do those things, it's actually only the institution defending itself that gets coverage. You don't get coverage about, the qualifications of that person. You don't get necessarily coverage around why does the public want that and what does it take to change it? Because that's the reality is if you're going to change things, you are going to upset some people. You're going to upset the status quo and the institutions are going to push back. And that's the way the world works, right? There's sort of like no reason to get mad at that. But if we really want to see change happen, we have to change that dynamic. We need to find a way to discuss what we want and how these things that we're doing in these institutions are related to that. So I'd actually say it's an example of when people ask the question, why is it so hard to change things? I'd say it's just that. I worked there for 8 years. I had every qualification you could need for the job. I was more qualified than almost any of my predecessors. And I went to change things that had been asked of me to change and had been demanded to change for the public good. But the things that got coverage were not that. They were, gossip and fear mongering, I think. So I think that that's one lesson. I think the other lesson for myself is actually just not to stay silent. And I think for me,
Mm.
that's really lifelong journey and like not to get too deep into, I'm not going to make you my therapist on this call, but I have always been a very quiet person. And I've always been someone who, I sort of don't know what I was taught it, but that I should be seen and not heard, right? That you don't complain about things, that if something that's wrong happens to you, you don't talk about that. If you talk about it, you're seen as a complainer. You never want to rock the boat. But I think, that's a complicated thing because when you get into these leadership positions, there's no doubt that I got there in part because I didn't complain.
Mhm.
I didn't talk about some of the uglier things that I had seen. I never made it about me. There's no doubt I got there in part because of that skill. But I'd also say once I was there, I never actually had any forum to just speak up and say, like, I'm a person and here's how I feel about these things,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And I think that that's just been something in my time off I've really been working on. And I think even
Mhm.
still,
Mhm.
even after that experience, I took a year off, right? And I didn't talk to anyone about anything. I traveled, I went to concerts. I really tried to, I think, just kind of find my peace back. And even then, when I started to come back out and do some mentorship and do some speaking in the press about the things I cared about, immediately that sort of attention went back to me. And so what I realized there was actually trying to say nothing in an effort to be good and be well behaved and be seen as sort of serious is a losing one. And I think that that's if there's anything I could go back and change. I do not believe in regret, so I'm not going to say regret. If there's anything it taught me that I want to teach other leaders is that
Mhm.
the encouragement that people will give you to be quiet about what's happening is bad advice.
Yeah.
The only
Yeah.
way to make real change in the world, right, is to like argue and inspire others that that change needs to be made, and how it needs to be made, and also that you're a person, to like not let yourself be flattened in the media by people who want to say that you're scheming or you have bad intentions when all you have are good intentions for these institutions. So I think that's a big lesson that frankly I'm still in the midst of learning. Like that's a lifelong change for Laura.
But as we're having this conversation. Bullying is real.
Yeah.
Bullying is real in our line of work. It's real in life, and separate of speaking up and speaking out, it's also not allowing people to say, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it's going to remain, right?
Yeah.
Or we would have never had a Serpico. We would have never had, right? Historically, as someone who's lived through
Yeah.
many iterations, right, of different things, so I think, again, kudos to you for one saying, hey, these are the things that need to happen. And you can leak, you can run to the whatever, right?
Mhm.
But I'm going to remain steadfast because I know this is the right thing to do despite the noise, right?
Yeah.
Now let's talk about another
Wait,
thing.
can I
And
actually just make one more point on that before we move on? And I think because it's a good one for this moment, the day after election day, right? Think about Andrew Cuomo, who's known for that exact sort of leadership, right? Of that sort of, you know, savage bullying of government to your own aims. Um, and think about if no one had ever spoken up about that. Because we all knew that's what he was like for years, right? Like, have you ever come across someone who didn't know that? I haven't.
Mhm.
It took those women who spoke up to open the door for everything that's happened over the last few years, and for someone like our now mayor-elect to actually even be able to say there's a better thing than this, right? There's something more hopeful. There's a different way to govern than to just like bully other people into doing what you want. So I think it's just like such an important lesson for now that speaking up as hard as it can be at the time and even for a while does eventually make the difference. If those women had not spoken up, we would not be sitting here today with Mom Donnie being our next mayor.
Yeah, and think about the impact also for our former mayor, not the one, not Eric Adams, but Bill de Blasio, when he spoke out publicly about some of the tactics then Governor Cuomo used and the sort of the repercussion he received, right?
Yeah.
And the blowback he received. But at the end of the day, to your point, people shouldn't remain silent in the face of, it takes a courageous person because you're going to encounter in some cases, right? People who get up every day of their lives to try to whatever intimidate people. But
Yeah. And it
again,
takes time, to your point. Like sometimes you have to speak up and wait and hope it makes a difference, right? Like you don't necessarily get
right,
the satisfaction of speaking up and having people affirm that view the next day. And I think that's always, I was sort of like raised in, I think, civil rights politics. And I think that was very formative for me because what I always understood is you will not see the fruits of your work the next day. And so
mhm,
I wasn't going to change my mind just because I spoke up and things were still hard for days or weeks or months. I understood eventually one day it would get better because I had said something. But I think you see that in these dynamics. It takes a while. It's not,
yeah.
and it's really, I think, brutal sometimes in the period after you say something.
So, Laura, in that vein, there's another thing that in terms of the many articles written about your agency, some related to you, some totally unrelated, but just happen to be in the footprint of the FDNY, the permitting process,
Oh yeah.
uh, sort of fast tracking permits and the mayor calling about the Turkish embassy or something and et cetera, et cetera. But here's what I would say on a personal note. It's been known to happen, and I'd love to hear your sort of take on it because I know for a fact small business owners that have said, I am paying rent. I've poured my entire life savings into opening or trying to open this business. I have an expediter I have to pay. I have an architect I have to pay. I have permits across the city, right? From DOB to
Yeah.
this one and I can't get anything done because of the bureaucracy. And FDNY has a reputation as being right up there as, if not the worst, damn near close to it. So talk about the permitting process. And obviously we don't want a structure to fall on someone's head,
Yeah.
right? And I'm assuming that's what this is all meant to prevent, right? Worst case scenario. But now it's become more of a brick and mortar stores are saying we have a hard enough time surviving just our rate. I mean, every small business, I think within the first 2 years, they fail. That's
Yeah.
just the law of averages. But I want you to talk about the permitting process and in reforming it while you were commissioner, having to work through all of this. Because then it's like, oh my Lord, the US, there's a bunch of drama around that
Yeah.
and the alleged list of people cutting the line and that, drama. So talk about the process in general and how you navigated any reforms of any through that.
Yes, I would love to talk about that, especially I'd also love to talk about what I think the next administration can do on day one to fix this. So first we'll go back and then we can go forward. But I'm very happy you brought up the other piece of this because I think what's been really unfortunate over the last year is that This is actually a two-part problem, right? One is the corruption, which we absolutely like have to eliminate from the system. But the other half is that we have businesses, small businesses, hospitals, schools, like essential institutions and entities in our city that are not getting open because of the backlog, right? So we have both problems. And, unfortunately, the corruption was so bad, it really caused an even greater delay and sort of halt in all the rest of it. It made the backlog worse. And we had to tackle that first, right? You can't have people, taking bribes to do their government jobs. And so that's understandable. But now that we're past that, we can't just set that aside and say, good thing that's over. Let's go back to the way things were, because the way things were was horrific for institutions in this city, one. And two, any backlog you have is going to create the conditions that make something ripe for corruption, right? And so, like, we all have an interest, whether it's for corruption, small business, a school or a hospital that you're trying to open. We all share an interest in trying to make this process move faster and be more transparent. And to your point, while the meaning is good behind these laws, it is meant to keep people safe. I can definitely say that when you create a system that has such a big backlog, you actually end up erasing any gains, because then people do try to go around the system, right? Most people will participate in a system that works efficiently and allows their business to open quickly. But if you can't give that to them, you do find businesses that just go ahead and open without complying with any rules at all. And that puts us in an even greater place of risk. So I think it's like really important to understand like what is on the line here when we do this. And so, I think what I would say is a couple of things. One, just to give a great example of, sorry, sirens. A great example of how much can be
Yeah,
done.
but I don't hear any background, just so you
Oh, you
know,
did?
Laura.
Okay.
So go
Sorry, there
ahead.
was
I
an
don't,
ambulance going by.
I'm fine on my end.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Is there was a brief period, and this was before the investigations and the indictments, and so unfortunately it sort of all got put on hold. But there was a brief period where we were able to get both more funding, more staffing, and some technology changes. And that alone, for that brief period before those changes were even fully implemented, before the technology really had been widespread, wait times went from 16 weeks to 3 weeks for these businesses. So like
Oh,
imagine
okay.
that. Like I know you get these calls, right? Imagine a business that can get this done in 3 weeks instead of 16 weeks, and the difference it will make for them and their ability
Mhm.
to remain open. So I think one, we like have to remember that in the midst of all this, for a brief period, we did this and it worked. And that can be done
But it
right
was
away.
about, but Laura, it was about personnel, because I've heard that too from agencies. OMB won't approve me hiring. I don't have the lines, I don't have the bodies, but is one of the problems personnel? You don't have enough inspectors? Because
Yes.
some agencies struggle with that. We want to
Yeah.
enforce or we want to help, but we don't have enough people or
Yeah.
man or woman power.
We don't have enough people, and think about the size of our agency, right? We have 17,000 people, but only a couple dozen lines dedicated to the work that you and I are talking about. So I think that's part of the problem. People think the agency has a lot of people, but this is specialized work. There's only about 300 people in the entire Bureau of Fire Prevention, and there's only a few dozen that do these specialized inspections. And those are vastly underfunded, one. And two, they're really competitive jobs. And so when we go to offer someone a job, we need to be able to hire them quickly. And as you well know, if it takes 12 or 15 months to hire somebody, they're gone. Especially if what they have, their skills are in demand, which these skills are, they've gone elsewhere. And so we not only
That's right.
need the money to hire, the lines to hire, we need an ability for government to turn that hire around immediately. Otherwise, we have almost no chance of even filling the lines, the limited lines that we've been given. But they make such a substantial difference when they do. And that's why I say, part one of that vast drop in the wait time was just the ability to get people and to get them quickly. And then a piece of it was also about streamlining like the technology behind it, right? How does this work as a
Mhm.
city? How do we know things that are coming down the pipeline, right? Like how do we know if there's going to be 50 businesses or 500 businesses who need an inspection next week. And that's something that technology, that AI can really help with. It's something the city didn't used to be able to predict. And that's sometimes why you'd see these like ebbs and flows in how long it took. But technology has really given us the ability to predict that now. And we started using some of that. But imagine what we could do if that was like true, not just across the FDNY, but like across all of permitting, right? What if DOB could tell us 3 months ahead of time how many inspectors to have available on a given day so that every hospital, school, and business that needed an inspection got one on the day they needed it. And then the last thing I'd say, just sort of like on what could change, so some of it's funding, some of it's technology. There's also a big piece of this that I think is really important and we need to do something about. There are a lot of bad actors in this system that are middlemen. So you've got the businesses, but the businesses generally are not like installing their own sprinkler system, right? Hopefully not, or putting in their own range hood. They're hiring a contractor to do that. And what we see in the fire department is you'll often get a bad contractor who submits a set of plans that are only even 10% complete. That we couldn't even look at them, let alone inspect it, let alone pass an inspection. But once they've handed them over to us, they say to their client, I gave it to the fire department, it's on the fire department. And we don't do anything to punish vendors in the system for doing that. And that's really often creating a lot of wasted time. It's wasted time on the fire department, it's wasted money for the small business owners. And it gives everybody the impression, I think, that there's a delay in the inspection when in fact, there's a bad actor in the system, right? Who's saying there's something ready that's not ready. And we do see in other municipalities, even in DOB, that they have created systems where you reward the sort of certified businesses that submit things properly and that you disincentivize or even eventually ban the middlemen and the architects and engineers who submit bad plans and try to put the work on the city or on the small business owner. So we really need to be doing that as well.
Or talk about now is there any, no, so there was a post story about you allegedly trying to join this administration, which you quickly refuted and said, fake news. Talk about that and what if any, so you would be willing to be helpful to the admin, but what about that story? And why would someone be inclined to do such a thing?
Yes, so the story is totally false. I've never spoken to anyone, nor do I plan to. But I think, as you pointed out sort of earlier in our conversation, it's a good example of what I said earlier, which is, I thought I could sort of like go away and be peaceful and be quiet and not weigh in. And all that it took was me coming out and working on a program I believe in, the 92nd Street Wise Women in Power program, for people to think I, was scheming, that I had a secret plan, that I was coming back into the fold. And I think that's really telling for anybody who wants to consider leadership, which is one, like don't worry about it. Haters are going to hate, right? And in fact, in some ways, I think I'm proud that I made enough difference in that department that I live rent free in some people's heads, that no matter what I do and how I
Yeah,
do
of
it,
course.
they think
Of course.
they think I've got some other plan or that I'm thinking about them, and I'm here to say I don't ever think about them. So
I think I take it when people talk about you, Laura, personally, I think it's a compliment because if you have nothing better to do than think about me, it's a good thing. Thank you.
yeah,
Right?
I
I
also
mean, the
think
many
for
things
those,
we have in this life to think about, right? If I'm
yeah,
consumed by someone else and what they're doing and not knowing, that's actually pretty cool.
I agree. It says
You
more
don't
about
think
them.
if anyone is relevant, if you're not relevant, people don't talk about you, feel a need to
Yeah.
worry about
I
who and
also
what
think
and
it
what
says
you're doing.
something about like how hard we need to work for the things we want to see in the world. And I will say this, when I was a younger person and doing organizing, I thought I was doing everything I could. And I was doing a lot, right? Like organizing, I think, is like the foundation of change. And I love it. My days as an organizer remain my happiest. But I was behind the scenes and I thought I was doing everything I could, but there was nobody pushing back, right? Because I was behind the
Mhm.
scenes and I was quiet. I think what I realized is to really see the changes that you want, you have to put yourself out there until someone sees you as effective and powerful enough to push back on. And until you are effective and powerful enough to push back on, you're actually not pushing hard enough. And so I think it is a sign that you've actually done a lot and that it's working for someone to be mad at you. It doesn't mean it feels good, but I do think it does give me a certain amount of pride that I am actually pushing hard enough on
Can I give you,
region of the
can I
world
give you,
I want to
can I
see.
give you a sports analogy before we move on to
Yeah,
the next question?
I love sports analogies.
No one, people put three blockers on Lawrence Taylor because
Yeah,
he was Lawrence Taylor, right?
yeah, exactly.
People double team Kobe Bryant because he's Kobe Bryant. If you're not a grade A talent, then, I don't think people are that consumed. But
It's true.
Laura, I want you to put on your strategist hat now and your organizer hat. Why was Eric Adams a one-term mayor? Understanding
Oh,
98, you know this, 98% of incumbents get reelected.
yeah.
You have the budget power, you have the executive power, you run agencies. I want you to just give it to me straight. Why was he a one-term mayor?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think if there was anything I think I would have liked to see change that would have made a difference, I think he needed both like that one big thing for people to hope and believe in. And that, for us, it was pre-K when we worked in the de Blasio administration. For the mayor-elect, it's, the rent freeze, and affordability. And I think that people really want to see that. People want to see that you are going to make not only big change, but like hopeful change that's going to make their lives better. And I think that not having that really hurt him. I also think that just some of these, smaller things that we're talking about that didn't get done, like it should have been easier to get a permit for a small business in the city of New York. It should have been easier for some of these things to just sort of make government like easier to interact with. And I really think that that hurt him more than anything. I mean, obviously the investigations are what everybody talks about, and certainly you can probably attribute some of those things not getting done to the distraction of the investigations. But I really think that mostly what New Yorkers want is to see the things they need get done quickly and efficiently. And they want to see change and believe in it. And not getting that, I think, is what hurt him most of all.
I
One thing
think
I would say that actually he has said, and I agree with him, is I don't think early on the coverage of him was very fair. As time went on, obviously, it was going to be about the investigations, and it has to be once something like that is happening in government. But I do think early on he was right about that, about his coverage.
I have my own, and I'm going to share. I think Peter Kaufman said it the best. He majored in minors,
Yeah.
elected forms, pulling chairs from reporters, not meeting the council. I mean, these are, sweeping in the corners, like we call
Yeah.
it. But
I think
that's
that
my own.
really smart. And actually, I was on New York One yesterday, I think, and they asked me kind of like, what is the one thing that you'd say to a mayor like who's going through these transitions? And that was it, which is you can't micromanage. And I don't say that as a matter of best practice. It's actually that if you do, you won't get enough done because the city is so big and it moves so quickly. And I think what's really hard for people is that you want to see no mistakes. You want every person in city government to do things exactly the way you would have done them, but you just can't. You have to accept like city government's too big. People are going to get it wrong. They're going to do it the way you wouldn't do it. But if you spend all your time trying to control that, you won't get those big things done, right? And you need all the bandwidth in the world, even just to get those few big things done. So, I think you're right. I think the advice for the next mayor and any future mayor is like you've got to hire good people and let them work, even if that's a little differently than you would have done it, so that you can stay focused on a few major things that you want to change New Yorkers' lives and you want to be your legacy.
Laura, why'd you step down? Why didn't you say I'm going to ride it out?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Why did you decide to step down as FDNY commissioner? First woman, right?
Yeah,
And say, I'm
that,
going to stick
that
it
piece,
out. And
yeah, that was piece was always hard for me, as are other people depending on me and do I need to keep going for them? But for me, I have always known when I had sort of hit my limit on anything. And I knew that I was not 100%. You know, I had really difficult circumstances coming into the job, right? Being acting, I was doing both my old job of first deputy commissioner and commissioner. I had, you know, not taken any time off during COVID and had been, you know, in the city at the agency running things. And I really just had maxed out the energy that I had to give to the job. And I knew that. And I'd actually say, you know, I think a lot of leaders hang on too long for all the reasons we've sort of talked about here. Sometimes it's for the power, sometimes it's for the way it feels, sometimes it's for the people who are counting on you. I think that we really need as leaders to not fall into those traps. You know, we need to think we're not the only person who can do the job and to know there are other people who can do it too, because nobody needs a boss who has, you know, is out of energy, is out of battery. And so I knew for me, you know, I am both religious and spiritual. And I will say for me, there were many very powerful signs in both my life, that it was just the right time. And I've never once doubted that decision. Everything that's happened then has happened since, has told me it was the right time for me.
We're gonna wrap this up soon, but I have three more questions. Why did Ma'am Danny win?
I think a
What did
couple
he get right? How did he come
Yeah.
from 1% polling, 2% to mayor?
Yeah. I mean, I
What
think
kind of getting your strategist hat?
start with the fact that he is a generational political talent, right? Like his ability to communicate, to understand the difference between like what people want and what people are telling him people want. And we sort of talked about that at the beginning of like how important that is as a leader to actually be talking to the boots on the ground. And that's like whether you're going to be mayor or you're going to be commissioner of an agency, don't let the noise get in the way of what the actual people who are affected by your work want. And so I want to say, like, those two things are about him, right? His communication and political talents and his ability to realize that there were people on the ground in New York City who are residents and voters who wanted something different, and to ignore all the people telling him, like, you're making all these other people mad along the way is an extraordinary talent of his. What I'd say the dynamics are that set this up well, and that I've seen on every insurgent race that I have ever worked on, they are the ones you look for. And that's really about the field. It's about Cuomo, which is when you're looking for someone to run against as an insurgent, you want someone that everybody knows and that they already have an opinion on, and that that opinion is largely negative. Because what that means for the insurgent is they have very little room to move. Their numbers are fixed, right? Almost everybody knows Cuomo, almost everybody has an opinion, and that opinion is majority negative, and that was never really going to change, and it didn't, right? We saw that it never really changed. Whereas when you are unknown and you're bringing a new message, there's a lot of risk. Your message may not resonate, people may not hear you, but if they do, you have 100% of people to convince about who you are, about a new vision for the city. Like you have a lot of opportunity to actually change people's minds about what they want. And so I think that that, you know, setup, it was very smart of him to see it. But I'd also say for all those folks who were not fans of his and who really kept arguing for Cuomo, like my advice that I would have given them is they should have picked a different candidate. You know, picking a candidate that's so well known with such high negatives is the kind of insurgency candidate that like people want to run against. It's actually the best chance you have. You always have a low chance as an insurgent, but you have a better chance about with somebody with those negatives than you do against like say two competing new visions of the city. And so I think that's what he did right. You know, he took his talents, he took his instincts for people, but he also ran against the right person. And I'm sure everybody told him not to because it was Cuomo. And I think exactly the opposite. Andrew Cuomo is who you'd want to run against if you were going to run an insurgent campaign.
Laura, what advice would you give your 21-year-old self?
Oh, I would tell her to stop being so worried about everything and so scared to speak up. You know, I was until a few years ago absolutely refused to speak in public. You know, thought my role in life was to remain behind the scenes. And I'm glad I figured it out when I did. You know, I don't regret that. But if I was to give her any advice, it would just be to tell her, like, it's okay to speak up. And that's part of, you know, changing the world in a way that you want to see it is talking about that change and your vision of the world.
Best day on the job as fire department commissioner.
Oh, there's so many. You know, there's very few times where we're at a press conference and nothing bad has happened. And there was one press conference right after I was officially appointed as commissioner where both we did an extraordinary and dangerous rescue. Our members, they used a rope on a high-rise building, and they successfully rescued everybody, and everybody survived. So one, I remember that as, like one, it's just such a heavy job, especially the public part of it. Almost always something tragic has happened where we did something that was amazing. Our members risked their lives to do it, and everybody survived. But also, after I was done with the press conference, I turned around and there was a little girl there trying to talk to me. And she said, and she was with her dad, and her dad, were saying, we just wanted to come up to you because my daughter like can't believe that she's seeing a woman in this job. And I mean, you can even hear me getting choked up now. I just don't think of myself that way. I know it's maybe weird, but like I wanted to do the job because I was good at it. I cared about the fire department. I thought I would do a good job leading the department. I really don't think about myself as that maybe public facing person that other people say. And I certainly never thought about how much it could inspire like another woman or a little girl about what was possible. So like the combination of that day of feeling like I was doing something right and that for once we didn't have to talk about tragedy in this line of work still remains kind of one of the most special days for me.
Worst day.
I mean, every line of duty death that we've ever had, those they never leave you. The anniversaries come around, you think you're okay, and it all comes back to you, and you are always thinking about those families. And unfortunately for me, it's the first 5 minutes when I was acting at midnight, someone died in the line of duty on the job. So that first day I spent in the hospital with that family who is still absolutely dear to my heart, and I think about them every day. So those days will stay with you forever. It's by far the hardest part of the job that we lose people. They just never get over it.
3 most influential books you've ever read.
Ooh. So I also
That
to
made
say a couple
you,
of things.
they shape you as a person, like formed you,
Yeah,
that you
I'm a
had an
big
impact.
believer. I'm going to give you some nonfiction because what I find is people want
That's fine.
nonfiction.
That's fine.
But
It's whatever you want to
I
do.
want to say to your audience, I actually think fiction is what changes us. I think what we want to hear are stories.
Okay, I'll give you an example, right? As a young boy, I read Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
And that book is fiction, but it talked
Yeah.
about his buddy Ben. Remember Ben?
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, there are people that live that way somewhere,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I couldn't put it together because I was fairly young, but that's a fictional book.
Yeah.
Orwell's 1984 is another
Yeah.
one that's right? And it's
Yeah.
very eerily, right, what's happening in the world. And,
Yeah.
so go ahead, but I'll let
No,
you speak now.
I totally agree. And I would say that book for me at that age was a book called The Awakening. And it was the same thing. It was fiction. And, I probably was too young to understand half of what was in it. But what I understood is it was like this woman who didn't want the typical path and was wrestling with it. And nothing had ever struck me so much that that was also what I wanted and was wrestling with it. And so that's why I say I think often fiction is actually the thing that moves us more than anything because it like teaches us about like what's possible. But I'll give some books that I think might be more digestible to your readers. I think one I just finished. It's called The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. Also fiction. Just amazing dose of optimism for our times and frankly about karma. The other one called The Artist's Way, which is nonfiction. It's about how what we create and put out into the world is as much our influence as the work we do. And I think that's really important. I'm very focused on that right now. Like, how do we tell our own stories? How do we make art in ways that change the world? And I think no matter what you do and how technical it is, it's important to think about the fact that some part of your job is about creating something new, right? Even if that's like a new way of your workflow at work, or it's a new way of making your team feel more engaged or better about what they do, that it's important that like 20% of our time even in work, is about creating new things and about doing new things. And then I'd also say, actually, sort of my final one would be Brene Brown, and she has a few different books. But the idea of sort of leading bravely for regular people, I think, is a really important one. That, like, you don't need to be extraordinary to be brave and to do brave things. It's really about sort of like self-investigation and growth and change and learning from our mistakes and having hard conversations. And she's been very much influential on me in that way.
In your political, and we'll wrap with this, in your political life, three people that you look up to, that have mentored you, that you respect, that you want to be more like, if that's such a thing,
Yeah.
that have helped you throughout your career, and people that you feel get it right or as close to
Yeah.
what you want, hope to become at some point, or are, or
Gosh, that's so hard because there's so many people I admire. I'll give like I'm going to go across the spectrum. So when I worked for Barack Obama, one of the things he constantly called for was for people to go into government. And that was when I was on the campaign. And that's really been a formative experience for me, I think, which is understanding that doing really good work also means taking on stuff that often seems like less sexy or harder or more bureaucratic. And that's just as important as anything else. And so, like, that speech that he gave to all of us when the campaign was over about going into government, I think has been very formative for me. I'd also say, people won't know on your podcast, but my family has been exceptionally formative for me.
oh, that's great, that's great.
They are not only they span sort of ideological diversity and have always created an environment, no matter who you were, you're welcome at our kitchen table. And I think, like, that has really been my operating model for life. There's a reason I could go into so many spaces and like connect with people, is because it's always been about that like connection and respect for other people's opinions and about, breaking bread together. And then I say, finally, I think we were talking at the beginning of this about Dean Foolihan, who was the former first deputy mayor, was very much someone who I like modeled the nitty gritty of government off of and learned a lot from.
Most prominent person to come out of the Bay Area.
Oh, I don't know, man. I spent my life, not really. Sometimes in the Bay Area, sometimes in Flint, Michigan, sometimes in Chicago. So I don't know if
What would you consider home? I mean, I know New York is home, right? But in terms of would you
So that's a
consider
funny.
yourself from the Bay Area?
So I do not, but let me explain that and then we can get off. I know I'm probably rambling here. Home has always been a very hard concept for me to describe to other people because in my family, home is the place you make your home. So my grandmother left Italy and moved to Flint, Michigan, never went back. My parents moved from Flint and Chicago, respectively, to a small town, rural town in the Bay Area, and I moved from there to here. And what that's meant for all of us is that, like, there is no such thing as home in the traditional sense. If I went to my parents' house, none of our other family is there. If I went to Italy, half my family is there, but the other half is in Michigan. If I went, to Michigan, my parents wouldn't be there, but the rest of my family would be there. So for us, home really has always been about the place you land and make your home and your people. And for me, that is New York City. So it's funny when people ask me if I'm going home, I never know what they mean. I'm like, is it the Bay Area, which isn't, they often say San Francisco, but I actually never lived in San Francisco. Is it the Bay Area? Is it Michigan? Is it Chicago? Is it Italy? Or is it the place I consider home that's here? So I guess I'm unusual in that way, but I would say home for me is New York City.
Laura, thank you so much. Anything you want to add that I forgot to mention before we wrap?
Nice to see you. And it's nice to talk again.
Always, always,
Yeah,
always.
thanks
It's
for doing
good,
this.
and it's good to hear now. It's again as a friend. I mean, I don't know if I would have had the sort of strength to keep going. I mean, it was just like, so I commend you. Again, I commend you, one, for being the first, and big deal, and just the way you managed, the way you carried yourself. You walked out with your head held high, and you made a lot of changes to an institution that again is no picnic in terms of the way it's always been. So
I appreciate it.
congratulations
I didn't do it alone.
on
I'd say that much.
first
I had great people
yes,
all around me. So
yeah, yeah. But you know, the head that wears the crown rests uneasy. So
it is
you know,
true.
at the end, you know, people point at you. So thank you,
Yeah.
Laura, again for
No,
doing
thank
this. All
you.
right.
Talk to you
Have a
soon.
wonderful talk soon.